Before maps drew borders, before strangers claimed discovery, there were already names sung to the rivers and kingdoms etched into the stones. There were footsteps pressed into the red dust long before history was written, and songs that rose with the morning mist, naming mountains, rivers, and stars. This is not a story of what was built after colonization. This is a story of what existed long before it, of the land before it was called South Africa, before it became Namibia, before lines were drawn through sacred hills and languages were drowned in foreign ink. The question isn't who discovered the South, but rather, who remembered it first? Who mapped the stars above Mapungubwe? Who knew the rivers of the Cape by name before a ship ever crossed its waves? Who buried kings beneath golden rhinos, built cities of stone without mortar, and whispered prayers into the wind as the sun set beyond the savannah? This is not just archaeology. It is not just anthropology. This is memory. The answer to who founded Southern Africa is older than empire, older than the compass, older than the cross. It is written in rock, in rhythm, in memory, passed from drum to drum, from elder to child, from breath to fire. But memory fades when it is silenced, when names are replaced, when sacred hills are mined, when stories are dismissed as myth. And so we begin again, not from the books that erased, but from the voices that endured. We return to the dust, to the song, to the stone. Because buried in the land is the truth, that Africa did not wait to be discovered. She was already alive, speaking in a language the earth still remembers. This journey is not just history, it is a return. So come, walk with the ancestors, listen to the names beneath your feet. Let the wind remind you that nothing begins at the border. It begins with memory. And in Southern Africa, memory runs deep. Long before crowns or cities, the San and Khoikhoi moved with the wind and spoke with the land. They were not wanderers. They were astronomers without telescopes, philosophers without scrolls, scientists whose instruments were the stars and the stones. Their presence in Southern Africa stretches back over 100,000 years, making them the oldest continuous culture on earth. Long before the first pharaohs rose along the Nile, these first peoples walked these southern plains, reading the sky like scripture and leaving messages for the future etched into rock. The San people, often misnamed as Bushmen, were not merely hunters and gatherers. They were cosmologists of movement, mapping time not with calendars, but with the migration of animals, the rhythm of rain, and the cycles of moonlight. They did not build monuments of stone, they built monuments of meaning. Their rock art, found in sacred caves across Namibia, Botswana, and South Africa, is among the most profound visual records of the early human consciousness. In ochre, charcoal, and mineral pigment, they painted dreams on stone, not to decorate but to remember. Antelopes with elongated limbs, dances mid-leap, shamans transforming between worlds. These were not scenes of daily life. They were visions, cosmology in motion, archives of the invisible. The Khoikhoi, cousins to the San, were pastoralists, keepers of cattle, workers of roads, builders of temporary but sacred homes. They moved in harmony with the seasons, knowing which grasses to follow, which rivers to rest beside. Their knowledge of medicinal plants, animal behavior, and ecological balance was not folklore. It was science rooted in generations of observation. Their society valued balance, not conquest. Cattle were not capital, but spiritual companions, their horns echoing the crescent moon, the milk a living link to the ancestors. Together, the San and Khoikhoi developed a language system unlike any other on earth. With its clicks, tones, and glottal stops, It mimics the rhythm of fire, of bird song, of life itself. These languages are among the oldest on the planet, encoded not just with grammar, but with cosmology. To speak in these tongues was to speak to the land, to the spirits, to the memory of time before time. Their rituals were not performance, they were portals. In trance dances under the stars, Sanhilias would enter altered states, channeling visions from the spirit world to heal the sick, find game, or restore harmony. The fire, the song, the circle. This was not entertainment. It was sacred technology. A spiritual science passed through rhythm and breath. And they left no ruins because they ruined nothing. The architecture was in the movement itself, a sustainability rooted in deep ecology. They did not claim the land, they belonged to it. Every footprint was made with awareness. Every plant taken was a prayer. In a world racing toward extraction, their way of life was a blueprint for harmony. And yet, their wisdom has been silenced, their knowledge dismissed, their language endangered. But the caves still speak. The dust still carries their echoes. And the stars, the same ones they followed, still rise. From their fires rose migrations, carrying iron, seeds, and memory into new rhythms of life. The world would change, new voices would arrive, but the first people never disappeared. They became the soil, holding every step that came after. Mapungubwe rose like a vision above the savannah, a hill not chosen for defense but for the whispers it caught in the wind. Perched above the confluence of the Limpopo and Shasha rivers, it wasn't merely a geographical crossroads, it was a spiritual one, where land, trade, and power converged to birth Southern Africa's first kingdom. From around 1070 to 1300 CE, Mapungubwe thrived as the heart of a society that was not only organized and hierarchical, but deeply ceremonial. This was not a scattered village. It was a state, a system, one of the first state-level societies in the entire region. Its roots lay in the great Bantu migrations, which began thousands of years before. As Bantu-speaking peoples moved southward from the Congo Basin and Great Lakes region, they brought with them iron smelting technology, agricultural practices, livestock herding, and complex social structures. By the time they reached the fertile plains of the Limpopo Basin, they were not settlers. They were architects of civilization. And in Mapungubwe, they shaped a society built not just on survival, but on sovereignty. The kingdom's capital, centered atop Mapungubwe Hill, reflected a sacred geography. The elite ruled from above, literally, as a symbol of spiritual and political elevation. At the hill's summit, archaeologists uncovered the remains of royal residences, ceremonial structures, and elite burials. This was not accidental. The elevation symbolized a divine connection, a place where kings spoke to ancestors, and the wind carried their words across the kingdom. Mapungubwe's rulers were not warlords, they were sacred stewards. Leadership was not taken by force, but consecrated through ritual, inheritance, and cosmic alignment. Gold, found in burial sites on the hill, was shaped not into coins, but into sacred symbols. The most famous artifact, the golden rhino, stood no taller than a hand, yet wrought with meaning. It represented power, wisdom, and spiritual guidance. To be buried with gold was not to flaunt wealth. It was to return to the earth adorned in cosmic truth. And the wealth of Mapungubwe was undeniable. The kingdom was plugged into global trade networks stretching eastward to the Swahili coast and beyond to India, Persia, and China. Glass beads from Asia, ceramics from the Far East, and Arabic inscriptions have all been unearthed in its ruins. In exchange, Mapungubwe exported ivory, animal hides, and most notably, gold. That gold, filtered through the hands of local miners and merchants helped shape international economies. And yet the world still asks if Africans built kingdoms. This was not a land on the edge of history. It was the center of a vibrant economic and spiritual web. And Mapungubwe was its beacon, a golden citadel in the grasslands. Its society was structured with intention. Commoners lived and farmed in the lowlands. The ruling elite, spiritual and political, resided atop the hill. The physical layout of the kingdom mirrored its worldview. The higher you went, the closer you were to the divine. Power was elevation. Leadership was proximity to the ancestors. And community was unity under the sacred. But even golden kingdoms fade. Around 1300 CE, Mapungubwe's influence declined, possibly due to climate shifts, resource changes, or internal shifts in power. Yet it did not disappear into nothingness. Its spirit moved, its architecture evolved, its legacy found new stone. And when Mapungubwe's light dimmed, its spirit found form in a new city. One built without mortar, but held together by meaning, memory, and the hands of those who remembered how to shape stone into story.
Great Zimbabwe, where stone carved like sound and silence carried memory. Rising from the southeastern hills of today's Zimbabwe, this city was not built with mortar, yet its walls still stand, as if held together by song. It was a city of mystery and mastery, of sacred geometry and sovereign power. From the 11th to the 15th century, Great Zimbabwe thrived as the political, spiritual, and economic heart of a kingdom that reached far beyond the walls that now remain. At the center of this stone marvel lies the Great Enclosure, a massive elliptical wall over 11 meters high and 250 meters around, constructed entirely of granite blocks meticulously cut and stacked. No binding agent was used, just precision, purpose, and the hands of architects who understood both structure and symbolism. The walls bend and ripple like waves of sound, curving gently through the landscape. This wasn't just engineering, it was expression, the manifestation of Shona cosmology in stone. Above the city on a rocky hill, the hill complex rises like an altar. This elevated area likely served as the royal residence and a ceremonial center. Its position echoed Mapungubwe's spiritual topography. Leaders residing above, closer to the ancestors, their authority descending from the divine. Within its crevices and platforms, archaeologists have uncovered ritual objects, soapstone carvings, and spiritual symbols, most famously the Zimbabwe birds. These soapstone figures, perched with abstract wings and watchful eyes, are believed to represent sacred messengers or ancestral spirits. They remain icons of Zimbabwe's identity to this day. But Great Zimbabwe was not an isolated wonder. It was plugged into global circuits of trade that pulsed across the Indian Ocean. From here, goods like ivory, gold, and leopard skins were traded northward to the Swahili ports of Sofala and Kilwa, and from there, across the seas to Arabia, India, and China. In return, the people of Great Zimbabwe acquired glass beads, Chinese porcelain, and Islamic textiles, fragments of which still rest beneath the soil. This city, landlocked by geography, was oceanic in reach. And yet, despite all its grandeur, Great Zimbabwe was nearly written out of history. When European colonists first laid eyes on the ruins in the 19th century, they could not believe that Africans had built such complexity. The idea of Black African civilization clashed with their colonial myths. And so, they invented stories, attributing the structures to Arabs, Phoenicians, or lost white tribes. They claimed the stones were too perfect, the city too advanced. They denied the obvious. The Africans built greatness without permission, without conquest, without Europe. This misrepresentation wasn't just ignorance. It was strategy to strip Africans of historical agency and justify domination. But the stones never lied. The architecture matched Shona techniques. The oral traditions pointed inward, not outward. The ancestors will remember what textbooks forgot. The very name Zimbabwe tells its truth. Derived from the Shona words Dzimba Dzamabwe, houses of stone, the name is both literal and sacred. These were not just buildings. They were sanctuaries, homes for rulers, altars of memory, carriers of spirit. In every stone laid, there was intention, a message for the future. And now, centuries later, those stones still speak. Great Zimbabwe stands not as a relic, but as a revelation. Proof that Africa's south was neither empty nor silent. It was filled with voices carved in granite, economies shaped by diplomacy, and a society rooted in geometry, ancestry, and trade. While Europe fumbled in feudalism, the builders of Zimbabwe were trading with emperors across oceans and encoding cosmology into architecture. And though time dimmed its light, the legacy of great Zimbabwe did not die. It echoed in language, in memory, and new kingdoms that carried its wisdom forward. From this city of stone and silence came a story too powerful to erase. A story that continues to rise from the ground every time someone asks, "Who built this?" And every time the stones answer, The stone's echo didn't fade, it multiplied. From Zimbabwe, the Mutapa rose. Farther west, the Congo beat like a drum. In the landscapes of southern Africa, power no longer rested solely in one hill or one gold drift. It dispersed, branched, wove itself into networks of trade, kinship, and movement, a living web connecting hinterlands to oceans, savannas to coasts, iron to ivory. Salt flowed with copper. Iron met ivory. The South was not isolated. It pulsed within Africa's sacred web. The Mutapa Empire, born from the legacy of great Zimbabwe around the 15th century, expanded its reach across the Zambezi and Limpopo, organizing tribute, gold mines, and statecraft that spread the influence of the Shona-speaking peoples far into Mozambique and Zambia. From Mutapa, tributary states emerged, the Butua, Roswi, and others, each adapting architecture, gold trade, and sacred rulership in their own region. The Butua kingdom, later overtaken by the Roswi, controlled western Zimbabwe's gold trade and built on the stone traditions of earlier times. These states were not isolated fragments. They were nodes in a continental system. The Indian Ocean coast, once seen as distant, was intimately linked via the Swahili ports of Kilwa, Sofala, and Mombasa. From inland kingdoms like Mutapa and Butua, gold, ivory, and hides journeyed eastwards to dhows, waiting under monsoon winds, to Arabia, India, and China. But the flow of goods was matched by the flow of ideas, architecture, religion, language, kinship. The line between coast and hinterland blurred. The trade routes were arteries of civilization. Farther west, the Luba and Lunda kingdoms in the heart of the Congo Basin created their own versions of this web. The Luba state, emerging from the Upemba Depression and solidifying in the centuries after the first millennium CE, established complex political institutions grounded in sacred kingship and oral history. The Lunda inherited and extended these traditions, creating a federated network of tribute and trade across modern-day Angola, Zambia, and the DRC. What connected these interior states to the great southern empires was not just migration, but shared models of authority, resources, and commerce. Copper from the Congo, ivory from the south, iron from the highlands, all moved within the same orbit. As these kingdoms matured, they adapted iron metallurgy to their social systems. The Bantu migrations brought iron technology southward, enabling craft, agriculture, and urbanization. These technologies, along with sacred systems of kingship and ancestor veneration, provided the underlying architecture for the web. Kings were not just rulers, they were spiritual sentinels. Trade routes were not just economic, they were spiritual highways. The language of power spread along the same paths that the beads and gold traveled. In this age of interconnectedness, Southern Africa was no backwater, it was central. The great kingdoms of the south were part of a map that spanned from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, from the great lakes of the interior to the monsoon winds of the coast. Salt from the desert met ivory from the forest. Iron tools of the artisans found their way into the hands of chiefs and traders. Ships sailed not to discover civilization. They discovered civilizations already alive. In the sacred geometry of these networks, no kingdom stood alone. Mutapa looked west, Congo looked east, Luba reached south, the coast reached inward. And within this web, the rhythm of life, trade, spirit, and governance moved in unison. The stones of one empire heard the footsteps of another. The gold of one kingdom fueled the vessels of another. And the ancestors watched, not from afar, but at the crossroads. To understand Southern Africa is to understand the movement, connection, and shared legacy. It is to acknowledge that what appears as separate kingdoms were threads of the same tapestry, woven with iron, trade, and spiritual memory. The web of kingdoms was not an accident, it was intention, and it still hums in the land.
Before South Africa existed, before colonial compasses spun their labels across the continent, there was a different naming, one rooted in memory, in geography, in covenant. Before maps bore foreign stamps, sailors and scholars whispered of a land called Azania, the land of the black people. The phrase inked in Greek manuscripts and Arab maritime guides carried on Swahili tongues as traders dropped anchor on coral coasts. This was not mere geography. To name a land was to bless it, to ordain it, to root its destiny in the sky and earth. And so when land was renamed, the wound was deeper than loss. It was a memory erased. Inside the hinterlands, other names spoke to identity, culture, and belonging. Montwakasi echoed in southwestern lands, a term derived from Umbuthwakazi, meaning the great assembly of nations, celebrating a union of peoples in a vibrant mosaic. In the heart of the Shona-speaking kingdoms, the title Monomutapa, meaning ravager of the lands, signified sovereignty over gold-rich territories and powerful kings whose names shook the earth. And atop the sacred hill in the first southern kingdom lay Mapungubwe, Hill of the Jackal, a site where the ruling house sat between sky and plain, where gold-crowned consecration and memory became monument. These names are far more than labels. They are cosmological expressions. The landscape was alive. Rivers and hills held spirit. The sky was no background, it was scripture. To speak the name was to enter the relationship. It was to connect the spoken word to the rock, the tree, the ancestor. Naming carried sacred weight. Where a foreign tongue replaced it, the spiritual tie frayed. When colonial powers renamed rivers, hills, homelands, they did more than change a word. They rewrote the unseen map of the land. Colonial renaming was not innocent. It was erasure. It was the act of laying foreign grammar onto memory until the original syllables faded. Azania became South Africa. Munhumutapa became Rhodesia. Montwakazi was replaced by a territory of imposed lines. The moment a map changed the name, the story shifted. The land did not forget, but humans were told it did. The ancient voices were silenced, the old names buried beneath textbooks, treaties, and borders. And yet, the land does remember, because despite the imposed labels, despite the borders, the names still exist in song, in lineage, in local tongues passed from elder to child. They are the tracks of memory that no colonial ink can erase. To reclaim a name is to reclaim identity. It is to reach across time and say, I belong. I was here. I speak your name. In the echo of those syllables lies resistance, heritage, and power. So, when the question is asked, who really founded Southern Africa? Part of the answer lies not only in stones and kings, but in the names that first spoke the land into existence. And those names never left.
Then came the sails. White triangles cutting through the horizon like knives through time. First the Portuguese, feeling their way around the African coasts in the 15th century, seeking gold and spice, but finding something far more complex. Kingdoms already deep in trade, diplomacy, and spiritual order. They met the Kingdom of Congo, where royalty ruled from palaces and Christianity had been accepted not as submission, but as syncretism, folded into the kingdom's own spiritual worldview. They arrived in the lands of the Mutapa Empire and found well-organized societies managing mines, armies, and taxation long before Europe had fully awakened from its own feudal night. In the south, they encountered the Khoikhoi, moving across the plains with cattle herds, cosmology, and rich oral histories, not nomads, but pastoralists with purpose. And yet, the visitors did not see what was there, or rather, they refused to name it. The Portuguese wrote of untamed lands. The Dutch built a supply post at the Cape and called it the beginning. The British charted and claimed as though names had not already been spoken. What they saw, they misnamed. What they found, they claimed to have discovered. The maps did not reflect reality. They imposed it. The 16th and 17th centuries marked more than just contact. They marked the slow bleeding of memory. Land was no longer sacred. It became property. Borders began to emerge, not drawn by rivers or relationships, but by conquest and convenience. The mountains that once held stories now bore foreign names. The rivers that remembered ancestors were renamed after kings who had never set foot on their banks. And slowly the maps began to tell a lie that generations would believe. Among the most enduring falsehoods was the myth of the empty land. European settlers, particularly during the Dutch and British expansion, propagated the idea that vast stretches of southern Africa were uninhabited before their arrival, open, waiting, gifted by divine providence. It was not just a lie of omission, it was a strategy of justification. You cannot steal from someone who isn't there. You cannot conquer what does not exist. And so, through maps and doctrine, erasure became policy. But the kingdoms had never vanished. The songs had never stopped. What Europe called wilderness was already mapped in memory. What they called chaos was a different order, and what they thought forgotten, the land remembered. Because one cannot discover what has always been known.
The founders never vanished. They live in our rhythms, in the way we walk, speak, and sing. They live in our mother tongues, those ancient languages that once shaped law, lullabies, and cosmology. They live in the stones, still standing, still whispering. Mapungubwe, Great Zimbabwe, Mutapa, names that carry memory in their syllables. From the sun stars to the gold of the Limpopo, from the cattle paths of the Khoikhoi to the coral ports of Kilwa, Southern Africa didn't begin with sails or surveys. It began with memory. It began with meaning. It began with Africa naming herself. This journey through time has not been one of discovery, but of return. We've walked through the rock art of the first people, where the cosmos was etched in ochre. We've stood atop Mapungubwe Hill, where gold was not currency, but covenant. We've passed through the sacred walls of Great Zimbabwe, where stone curved like sound and power radiated without violence. We've moved through the web of kingdoms, Luba, Congo, Mutapa, watching trade and kinship braid the continent into one conversation. And we've listened to the old names, Azania, Monomutapa, Mutwakazi, Names born of soul and soil, erased by force, yet never forgotten. This is the truth colonialism tried to bury beneath flags and false maps, that Africa's civilizations were already in full bloom long before they were labeled. That African people had already built, believed, governed, and dreamed long before anyone claimed they were discovered. And in reclaiming these truths, we do not merely remember history, we reclaim identity. We dismantle the lie that greatness arrived with ships. We affirm that it was always here. To know this history is not enough. We must speak it, carry it, re-anchor it in our schools, our songs, our stories. We are the generation called to restore what was dismembered, to rethread the names, the meanings, the memories, not as nostalgia, but as navigation. If this story moved you, don't let it stay silent. Like this video to honor the stones that still speak. Share it so others may remember what was never truly lost. Comment. We remember their names to echo the voices that never died. And subscribe to History Store and help restore the timeline they erased.